Ledger is a writing podcast and maybe a journey into psychedelia. I'm your host, Austin Wilson. Today I'm chatting with debut novelist David Conner. That's right, debut novelist. And in fact, his book is out today, August 1st, 2023, from Melville House. The book is Oh God, the Sun Goes. David and I chatted a couple of months ago, I think, at this point, about his first novel, and that he's always, in fact, been writing, but we talk about how it felt to write his first novel, to have it come out. He actually has an undergrad degree in neuroscience, and during that time in school, he took a writing workshop with the writer Maggie Nelson. We also talk about something that's kind of becoming a touchstone for the show, and he mentions the genesis of his novel that kind of started with a few sentences that he wrote on his phone. And I've talked about this a few times in the past with guests and sort of asked, hey, do you write on your phone? Because I had heard a lot of people saying that. And I've actually started writing a lot more on my phone, even more so than the last time I maybe mentioned it. I kind of can't remember at this point, but I've turned out to kind of enjoy it. Anyway, David and I talk about the perspective of the story. We talk about how he utilizes the passage of time and our perception, the reader and just humans, of how time passes. And we also talk about whether or not his book is metafictional. And is it? You should read it and then maybe figure that out. We do tiptoe up to some stuff that David says he kind of doesn't want to dive too deeply into for fear of giving away the magic trick, including the aforementioned psychedelia/psychedelics. If you read Oh God, the Sun Goes, let David know what you think about it. It's a book where the entire sun disappears, literally, and in the sky, just it's gone. And everyone's kind of just totally okay with it, or at least not as freaked out as they maybe should be. Things sort of just kind of continue on. Read the book. Hit me up at austinrwilson.com. There's a contact form. You can reach out to me through there. Pick up David's book wherever books are sold, even at my affiliate link on bookshop.org. That's a great way that you can support the show and get some fantastic books at the same time. If I've ever interviewed someone and their work is available via Bookshop, it'll be on my curated affiliate link list. Please rate and review this show wherever you can, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, all those places. And then tell other people that you think would maybe like it. That really, really helps. All of those things really help get the show into other people's ears. But as for now, here is my chat with novelist, first-time novelist, debut novelist, David Conner, author of Oh God, the Sun Goes. Mostly because it's a first novel. Your first novel, debut novel, which is exciting. And I know all of the work that goes into making a book become a thing. So I'm super interested to know what's the first moment you can remember working on what was going to turn into Oh God, the Sun Goes. What's the first thing you remember working on?
Yeah, I do. I remember, I think it was May, and I just graduated from CalArts where I did grad school for writing. And
so May 2022, 2021?
This was May 2017.
2017. Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it just started as it started as the title, Oh God, the Sun Goes. And then a few sentences came out on my phone. Like a paragraph. And it just gave me this atmosphere and this feeling that felt like room to move in.
Yeah.
And the sort of, I didn't know where it was going, and for a long time in the writing of it, I didn't know where it was going. I think in some ways that might even come across in its sort of experimental form. But yeah, I remember I just graduated 2017. The title was there, and then the first few sentences, and then I put it aside for a year and came back to it. But that's where it started.
So are those first few sentences the sentences that ended up becoming the first sentences in the book?
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did you feel over all those years having those become the first and stay the first? Was that a struggle? Were you second guessing yourself?
No, I really for whatever reason, those opening sentences just gave me this feeling that was the book.
Yeah.
And so there was a way in which like there was no way that they could go in my mind. I certainly edited like that first paragraph later
Sure.
on. But yeah, I think I tend to like, I'm a writer who tends to like over self-critique as opposed to like let it fly. And so I think I just had such like a conviction with those lines that I like didn't let myself consider ever taking them out.
Yeah. That's a big, well, I mean, that's a big gap between writing it in 2017 and then having it still be the first words in the book. So that's definitely conviction. You
Yeah.
stuck with it.
For sure.
So how long, this is your first novel, like we said, but no, like I'm assuming you've been writing for your entire life in
Sure.
some form or another. Tell me a little bit about that and kind of the ways that you've used writing to get to this point.
Mm. Yeah, I have been writing in some sense my whole life, although my path to it has been a bit circuitous. Just in my undergrad degree was in neuroscience, and I grew up. My family, no one around me were really writers or artists. That just wasn't like a world that I could imagine like legitimately going into. Um, and so I went into neuroscience. I think because I was just interested in the mind and human experience, but I
Yeah.
was I was figuring maybe I would do it through some sort of potentially like uh, traditional or like lucrative means or something,
Sure.
becoming a doctor or building some sort of scary AI.
Right.
And it really wasn't until halfway through my undergrad that I began to realize that writing was just what I wanted to do. It was the thing that felt good as a process. Yeah.
Yeah, and generally it's not a like, you know what, I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to be a writer. Like that's not normally the way that
No.
you figure it out. But how, I mean, what was tell me about that process. What happened that you realized, neuroscience cool, but writing way cooler?
Yeah, I just remember I was in this like intro to chem lab where we were draining liquid through a crucible. And I was just so bored. And I remember leaving the lab and going back to my dorm and just like eating a burger and just like relaxing. And then I like ended up going back an hour later to see if the thing had drained, and it like hadn't at all. And at the same time, I was in a writing workshop with the writer Maggie Nelson. She was teaching at my undergrad at that time. And yeah, I just, I would be in this chem lab and I'd be like writing like sentences and poems down on my like in my lab journal. And so I think it just sort of, I just kind of moved in that direction. And yeah, it just sort of kind of came naturally as this kind of instinct.
What, and was the instinct to write fiction? I mean, you said you were writing poems and ideas and stuff, but
Yeah.
you're in a neuroscience undergrad. Were you thinking, man, I need words on the page? And where was fiction in regard to the thing you're reaching for?
Yeah, I think at first it was poems in undergrad just because there's something about that form that's brief. I didn't have time to write stories. And it's just such a different mode than the scientific method. It's so affective and there's so many ways you can explore feeling with it. I do remember I was kind of on the side writing this short story too. That was just like a totally deranged, like strange kind of like stoner story. um, that was really fun. So it was kind of both happening at once. And I think even with this book, you can see a kind of like interest in the sort of lyrical or poetic sensibility of words, not just as means to a plot, but also as a way to build mood, as a way to experiment with sound and the kind of materiality of language.
We've said a couple things already that sort of line up with one of the things I wanted to ask you about. Talking about being bored watching the liquid through the crucible, writing poetry because of the briefness of it, or that time. And that is a thing that I picked up on in your book. And specifically, you use paragraph breaks and page formatting as a way to denote the passage of time, also through the narration of the character. And I really wanted to talk about that function of using those paragraph breaks as a way to denote time passing, or as a way to denote something about time. In some cases, it means it's going faster. In some cases, it's drawing itself out. There is some dialogue and some narration that hints at that, the character's perception of time. Talk to me about how was that something instinctual? Did you think about that a lot? And was that there with the idea from the beginning?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think I have a special attention to spacing on the page. And I do think that comes from generally a more kind of lyrical or poetic attention to the page than traditional narrative storytelling. Yeah, I mean, I think the book I've written, it's set in the desert. There's there's just a sense of loss and this kind of emptiness, this the sense of a sort of cataclysm that exists below the surface, below each line, below each paragraph, below kind of each character's story. And I think those spaces on the page, those sudden jumps in time, those lapses in time, those like idiosyncratic movements of time were sort of my way of getting into the atmosphere of this world, which is just kind of full of gaping holes that are kind of everywhere. And so I think that's right. And what you're picking up on is these sort of pockets of space that pop up, both as literal space on the page, but then as jumps in time, for sure.
Yeah, it definitely comes across. And having some of the characters talk about how seconds feel like minutes, and that they can then feel like an hour, but it snaps back to feeling like a second again. It really does lend itself to seeing the page that way, with those gaps in the paragraphs. And also, I like what you said there about what's missing, because it is about the sun being completely gone, and it's just missing. Is that so? Did you think when you first started, I'm going to space it out like this, or is it just something that you noticed that you liked visually?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, it wasn't so much that I liked it visually. It was that I think when I wrote this, that I had there was a tempo to it.
Yeah.
To the pacing of the sentences, to the pacing of the story. And it was almost just part of kind of the score, in a way that I wrote a paragraph and then I just kind of felt this space. And I probably just hit an extra paragraph break without thinking too much about it.
Yeah.
Just because it felt right.
Yeah. Well, another thing you said right there, the score. Music plays a big part into how some of these characters are defining themselves, how they're interacting with each other, how the reader's interacting with the story. Let's talk about, and you've also mentioned, the musicality and the lyricism of writing the book the way that it is. Let's talk about music and its the ways that it has informed the story, because we have Bill Withers showing up. We have, other lyrics and songs showing up. Are those songs that you gravitated toward just because of their thematic connections? Tell me the connections that they have to what you're writing.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it did start with those Bill Withers lyrics in that opening scene where they're in the diner and that song comes on. And I like it in part because it's so recognizable, that song.
Yeah.
Ain't no sunshine when she's gone. And it's just kind of so on the nose in this kind of way that I found weird.
Yeah.
And I tend to gravitate towards the weird as a kind of aesthetic virtue. And I just, something about those lyrics, and this house just ain't no home anytime she goes away. I just felt like that was the book, the sort of like the unheimlich or the uncanny, or this kind of sense in which this world is unfamiliar as a result of this kind of loss that's occurred. And so, to be honest, I love music. I'm just a huge fan of music, and it does a lot for me to bring these lyrics in and to even vaguely hear in the back of my head as I read them what they sound like when Bill Withers sings them, and it helps bring me into that mood. And so I think more than anything, these songs whose lyrical content are kind of really on the nose for the book are also just a way for me to like vaguely hear some like musicality as I'm envisioning a scene or whatnot.
Yeah, I think also, everyone uses music to humanize each other, or almost as like markers to be like, oh, you like that song, I like that song, here we
Yeah.
are. And I did find it true that a human would be like, I'm going to put on this Bill Withers song because the sun disappeared. And it talks about how there ain't no sunshine, and that's hilarious. I'm going to get up and dance. And it did humanize the characters because we do those things.
Yeah, I certainly do. I do that. Thankfully, it doesn't annoy the people around me that I know. I don't think it does, but yeah, I'll be the guy who kind of just puts a song on his phone at like a given moment. And yeah, so yeah, it is just a way to kind of bring that into a space.
Yeah. So the very first thing I thought of when I was reading the book, it's about the sun disappearing, which is a massive premise. So the entire sun disappears, this thing that literally makes it so that we can be alive. And that premise is huge, that I was curious why you chose the perspective for the characters that you did, because that's a premise that very easily lends itself to third person, omniscient, and that's not where your story goes or how it tells it's not exactly that cut and dry, but I don't want to say too much for the people who haven't read it yet.
Sure.
But tell me about how you arrived at defining the perspective the way that you did through these first person. In some cases, it almost feels like an oral biography, kind of, where there are these like snippets of dialogue where people are just talking. Tell me about how the perspective was generated for the book.
Yeah, I think that's a good point and a good question. It is, yeah, the sort of premise of the sun disappearing in some way would present that kind of third person, maybe speculative, maybe kind of sci-fi treatment of a story where you would theoretically go into the details of how this world works and how it's possible that people are existing in a sunless world. But I think what I ultimately was interested in was both the kind of blurring of a sort of metaphorical and literal space, and how that rupture that is blurred between the physical world and the kind of internal world, how this rupture of a sun's disappearance affects works in a kind of symbolic way. I mean, the metaphor of the sun going missing, or sun as this sort of metaphor for love or life or whatnot, is a kind of central image. I think I was just much more interested in exploring the kind of symbolism and internal reality of the sun missing. And I think the sun also in this story literally missing physically helps establish this strange blurring of reality and internal life that is in a way symptomatic of I don't want to give too much away, but
Sure, yeah.
I feel like writing is a bit like being a magician, and that like you
Yeah.
don't really want to like reveal your trick or give your take too much of what you
Oh,
think
yeah.
you're doing. But
No, for sure.
yeah, but I think, yeah, simply enough, it was, I was much more interested in what it felt like for the sun to be missing than for it to than to consider the sort of sci-fi ramifications of this world.
Yeah, and there's a part in the book where narration talks about how people are still driving their cars. They're still going to work.
Right.
You know, the concept of the sun disappearing has not ended everyone's life, which is shocking that no one seems shocked. They're just like, yeah, well, I got to go to the grocery store. And that was one of the things that I latched onto is because it reads almost to me like a detective story mixed with this sort of speculative existential like journey. Did it feel that way as you were writing it?
Yeah, I think so. I like those two modes at once, or the detective story and the sort of existentialist story, because they can kind of compound to just create this sense of stupefaction or mysticism, or that as we're trying to understand this world, as we're trying to understand these characters, the character or the protagonist himself is a detective in a way. And so, yeah, I think that that's exactly it. I did want to write a kind of existentialist detective story that involved kind of trying to understand trying to understand who one is, how the mind works, and what's gone on in this world.
And there's a blurb on it from Jonathan Lethem. It actually reminds me of a couple of things that I've read of his. Gun with Occasional Music and Chronic City. There are these couple parts of it that sort of reminded me of some of those things. And the you've sort of already touched on it a little bit, but the metaphorical and the surreality of the story that you're telling layered on top of this search.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I love Jonathan Lethem's writing, and I love that aspect of his writing that he has written these sort of strange slipstream detective stories that I love. Yeah.
Yeah, I do too. They're fantastic. One thing I was curious about, I didn't even know if I was going to ask, is there an aspect of metafiction to this? And if this is one of those magician questions, that's totally fine. But the thing that I noticed is it's dedicated to M. And then there's a character that shows up called M.
Yeah.
And I was just curious about that line blurring of who am I listening to talk, and where's that line of reality actually shifting from?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for reminding me to be a magician, because I think I'm right on that.
Yeah.
But I will say that I kind of am so inclined to metafiction that I have to like stop myself.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've always loved metaphysical gestures in writing. I like Borges, or I remember reading this play, I think Luigi Pirandello, I think is his name. I'm probably messing that up, but it's called Six Characters in Search of an Author. And Italo Calvino can do it too, and I love Italo Calvino. And I'm so inclined towards metafiction, but I feel like it can be kind of too self-conscious or too kind of whatever that I have to kind of restrain myself. But it ends up always somewhere in whatever I write.
See, that's so interesting, because I am on the opposite side of that coin. When I write, I want to disappear myself. I want no crossover. And even to the point where it's become an in-joke with my friend group that if any metafiction or meta storytelling or self-referential stuff appears in a story, they are immediately like side-eyeing, like, oh, is Austin going to revolt? Like, is this the thing that's going to turn it off for him? But I mean, I wanted to ask about it just because as I was reading your book, I didn't get that sense. But seeing that connection between the dedication and the character did make me wonder. And I've read metafiction before that I really liked. Some Jonathan Ames stuff, City of Glass, some other weird stuff where the author shows up and he's running around with the characters. I'm curious what What draws you to metafiction? What makes it always want to show up on the page for you?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm glad that you didn't get too much metafiction. It means I sort of suppressed it well.
Yeah.
Yeah, what draws me to it? It's a great question. I mean, I think I think the act of writing, the act of creation is so interesting that when that in some way becomes the subject of the story, I'm into it. I think also, yeah, I'd have to think harder about. I mean, I think as I've gotten older, I've drifted further away from liking it as much because I feel like sometimes it just feels a little like self-conscious.
Yeah. Do you think it's impossible to take yourself out of the story?
I guess that's it. There's something about metafiction that in some way feels like honest, or you're sort
Yeah.
of tipping the reader off to the artifice of it all, that you're not necessarily claiming that your story, you're sort of showing the nuts and bolts a bit. And I kind of like that. I like when a story can acknowledge its own artifice and its own, what it's built on in these ways that doesn't pull you out of it, but that isn't trying to totally deceive you into thinking there's not someone kind of pulling the levers behind it all.
Yeah.
I think I like that. There's a kind of there's a wink at the reader that like we're in on something together that I like.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of oddly connected to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is the presence of God within your story. Uppercase G, lowercase, all the different iterations, and the idea of who's pulling those levers and who is directing. And I read an advanced reader copy, so potentially this is all just based on the advanced reader copy I have. And maybe I was paying too much attention. I mean, just reading every single page and seeing your acknowledgments and everyone you're acknowledging, and God's in there, lowercase G. And that got me thinking about God as a character within the story, but in an almost non-denominational, the universe as God story mechanism almost. Is that total crazy, like just off the charts bullshit? Or
is your take the idea that God is a character in some way?
In some way, yeah. Because many characters talk about where the sun went, what happened to the sun, it's hiding, the search for the sun, and I don't want to give too much away for readers, but answers that they may or may not find throughout the story really made me wonder if there was this character off the page that is almost hinted at by the absence of where the sun was, that it was taken. Yeah. I mean,
I really like that reading. I think that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that for sure. Yeah, I think the way God enters the story through me is the title.
Yep.
Oh God, the sun goes. And that kind of comes from more like God as a sound, or as a kind of like exclamation of oh God, as this sort of guttural feeling. And I think when I started writing the book, I was interested in language that came from that space of like language that kind of comes from almost like a pre-lingual space of feeling, these like short words that can be sounds instead of words. And so I think my way in, or God's way in to this story, was as a sound and as like the way it feels to say, oh God. But I like your idea of God being this kind of off screen, off the page character that is affecting the story in some way. That's really cool.
I'm definitely, I think, given to, for me, it's really fun to be like, oh, could it mean this? Could it mean this? And just think sometimes crazy things that would be fun if they were true. And I know obviously reader interpretation is a big part of stories being put out into the world. That was one of the ways I interpreted it.
I think that's there. Yeah. I mean, I think I wanted to write a story that lent itself to multi-directional interpretations, or I kind of, in a kind of sick and twisted way, wanted readers to be like spun off into like a form of psychosis, or like, or like these like lines of logic that I think, I hope that the book spins people off into like crazy lines of logic, to
Yeah.
be honest. But not crazy, just in a way that actually maybe some of those lines will kind of fall apart and be frustrating, but some will lead someone somewhere, and that'll be their own kind of road that they drove down based on the kind of car that I built for them. And I do think I was interested in kind of writing a story that was more a car than a road, in the sense that you don't need a map to read my story. Like I'm not trying to say something too specifically about like Heidegger's Das Ein, but if your mind takes you there, then that's like what I was hoping for, or anywhere really.
That's a really interesting concept. That you're more interested in writing a car than a road, and especially because your book literally has a map inside it on some pages.
That's right.
Which that makes me think even more about some of the concepts and stuff that I was thinking of. That your book made me think about. You do see some of your neuroscience background, I think, make it to the page. Talk to me about research that you had to do for the book and ways that it contributed to what you ended up writing.
Yeah, well, as I said, I did my undergrad in neuroscience, and I currently work in a neuroscience lab here in Canada that does research on psychedelics and altered states of consciousness. And so that's always just kind of somewhere in my mind. Yeah, most of the research I did was neuroanatomy. I think I've always sort of been interested in the brain as a map, and these sort of distinct regions that have specific psychic functions. And I think when I studied neuroscience with the heart of a writer, I was a bit frustrated by the scientific method, or how kind of reductionist the sort of view of the mind became to me, of these kind of discrete pockets that have these discrete functions, and it kind of took the mystery out of it for me. And so I think as I've gone further like down the writing path, I've become more interested in like mystifying these spaces and kind of making them a bit more opaque. Yeah, and so I think as far as the research goes, a lot of it was just recalling what I had learned in undergrad. And I sort of wanted to write a story where it wasn't necessarily magic school bus where all of a sudden we're in a brain, but rather, the way a certain novel might be set in the Civil War, this was set in a mind, kind of.
Yeah.
And neuroanatomy more as kind of atmosphere and landmarks than as a kind of sci-fi exploration. So I think once I figured that out, the story kind of moved through these spaces more just as names and landmarks than as like necessarily trying to like elucidate any kind of neuroscientific knowledge necessarily.
I guess maybe to almost put too fine a point on it, how closely related are psychedelics to the genesis of this story?
And literally, or
let's go literally first.
I might have to put my magician hat on for this one.
Let's go metaphorically then.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a psychedelic novel.
Yeah.
Psychedelic in the sense of the mind looking in on itself. I didn't want to write like a stoner novel. Like I didn't want to write like guy takes shrooms, goes in a car, and thinks he's Jack Kerouac.
Right.
But I have always been interested in the kind of foibles and like illusions of human consciousness and the gap between reality and our perception of it. And so I think, psychedelics can really bring that out. And I sort of wanted to write a story that did that without being like a hip shroom book.
Right.
But kind of a more like serious investigation of these trippy lapses.
Well, there's a part in the book that I think touches on that. There's a part where someone's talking about sight and vision and not being able to see vision itself, the act of seeing. And that's related, I think, to the question for me of, well, one, a mind looking at itself, can it even perceive, like, and also related back to the metafiction thing, like, are you even capable of writing yourself in a way that seems true to others, or is it just like, look, there's a funny made up Austin in this story Austin wrote?
Yeah, to the point of the idea that the eye can theoretically see any point except for the point from which it's looking is a concept borrowed from the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, who I
Yeah.
was kind of put onto by a friend here in Canada named Sam Welle. And it is like a kind of perfect way of expressing the invisibility or the kind of breakdown of logic that comes about when you try to see yourself or who the I is, either EYE or the capital I. Yeah, and so I do think in some way the book is interested in trying to solve these impossible logics, and that's kind of one of them, locating the self or locating a, something that's gone, such as the sun, which seems kind of impossible to
Yeah.
find, even though our narrator thinks he can. And so, yeah, I think there is something to that concept that spoke to this kind of impossible quest.
So that's very deep on like deep on layers where it's not just the sun's missing. Oh, what are we gonna do? There's a lot more going on, which means I'm really interested in the actual nuts and bolts of
Sure.
putting words on paper. How did you maintain the story going forward as you were writing? And literally, were you writing it longhand? Were you writing it on a computer? How did you maintain your thread on the story as you were writing it, and the real good details about what were you even writing with?
Almost exclusively on the computer. There's something romantic about handwriting, but I can't. It's too slow for me, and my handwriting is too bad. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the book was actually written in these kind of semi-conscious states, generally in the middle of the night. Like I'd wake up with a scene. Like there's literally a chapter in the book that I kind of dreamed from beginning to end, and it's the chapter in the diner in Tempe, not the first one, but the second one. I'm not going to give too much away about it, but that sort of just came as a dream, and I woke up in the middle of the night and just kind of wrote it, and it didn't change that much. And so that was part of the process, was kind of finding these like semi-lucid states to kind of tap into this like fuzzy, blurry psychic space that the narrator exists in.
So is that something you were like planning on and cultivating?
It kind of just happened. I mean, I think I was living in the world of this book. It was kind of, I was just thinking about it kind of obsessively, and so it would appear in my dreams. And maybe I'd been like working on that chapter and it wasn't quite right, and then I'd go to sleep and it would kind of come out right or something. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's also, I wrote it entirely sequentially. I don't really know how to write any other way. And I wrote it for the most part without knowing what it was or where I was going. I didn't have an outline, and it wasn't until maybe halfway through that I started to like think ahead. But it was really truly experimental in the sense of kind of forging forward on the open road without knowing where we were going.
Do you remember when you felt that you were finished?
A couple times. That's a good question. I felt I was finished a couple times. It's hard to locate one time.
Yeah.
I still almost don't feel like I'm finished, even though.
Well, that was, I was going to ask that, because debut novel carries a lot of, weight and fears and all kinds of stuff, but feeling finished or feeling that you've accomplished the thing that you set out to accomplish. Do you feel that at all, that you accomplished it?
Do I feel that I accomplished it? I think so.
Yeah.
I do. I think it's helpful that it was this sort of experimental process wherein it's not like I had certain benchmarks to hit in a certain way. I kind of wrote it, and then what it became is what it was. I'm lucky to like still like it, I think, or to like be proud of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've edited it so much that the fact that it still holds something for me, it feels like an accomplishment. And
so you mean you specifically edited it?
Yeah, just I've gone through it enough and turned over chapters in my head, and to the point where I know sentences like the back of my hand, which can kill it, but there's still something like really there for me. And I think ultimately I just wanted to create an atmosphere, and something that kept you in it, and it does that for me when I read it. So I'm happy with it.
How many times do you think you've read it?
Oh God, Uh, I don't know, an embarrassing number of times.
Well, I think it's something that readers don't always think about, especially if they are like maybe talking to the author or interacting with the book in some way other than just reading it, that it's not just like, oh, I wrote it and then I gave it to this person and they published it. Like the journey is much longer with a lot more steps in it, and rereading it, editing it, even before you get an actual editor outside of yourself, there's just a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for me at least, a lot of writing is rewriting,
Yep.
writing a chapter, scrapping it, writing it again, editing it, writing it again.
Did I read online that you also write code?
Uh, I don't know what dark websites you're on where you would learn that, but I am in undergrad. My minor was in computer science. I don't code anymore, thankfully. That's another thing that I would have dreams about when I was like in coding. I would like dream of like if and for loops, and those are not pleasant dreams.
So what's funny is I just started learning JavaScript
Okay.
2 weeks ago.
Okay.
I know a little Python, and by a little I mean like the littlest.
Sure.
But it's one of the things that I thought of when I was looking at how your book deals with time, and how those if thens, else ifs, loop statements, all those things. And weirdly, I've started thinking of some of the stories that I work on, trying to think about them in ways where it's like, if this happens, then this happens, which is not, revelatory by any means. But I am curious about the connection between writing code
Wow.
and writing fiction, especially hearing what you just said, which is you rewrite a chapter, then you get rid of it. Seriously, the thing I was thinking of is me trying to make the JavaScript code that I was writing last week for this crappy little program where I'm rewriting all these lines of code and running it. And really, that's almost the same as me writing a chapter and then reading it and being like, nope, do it again.
Yeah.
Do you think you're using those same portions of your brain, or have you pushed away from coding? And
it's a great question. I've definitely pushed away from coding. It hurt my brain. And it was not for me. But there's something about editing and writing code that like feels similar. I mean, I think, and I wonder if you can relate to this, but I feel like obviously so much of writing is creative and expressive, but a lot of it is just like problem solving. A lot of it is figuring out which word will work where based on the grammar of the sentence and the way it sounds and what happened a page before. There is like a kind of data structure that is writing, and that like involves, I think, like a mathy or sciencey part of the brain. And so I'd like to drift as far away from Python as I can at this point in my life. But I do think that perhaps it flexed that sort of muscle of problem solving and thinking of writing as geometry, as shapes, as these problems of logic where it's not simply expression, but it's figuring out how to tweak something, which I often find editing to feel like that.
Yeah, I do too. I agree with almost everything you just said.
Yeah.
The big thing for me, that because I'm such a new person or I'm such a new coder or programmer, however you want to say it, that it's still exciting. I'm very excited by it. But the big thing that I've thought of when I first started this show and wanting to talk to people who wrote, one of the things I thought about was computer coding and whether there's elegance to that style of writing and where it crosses over with the styles of writing that I'm much more comfortable with, fiction and comic books, all those things, and just the ways that they inform each other. But also seeing what you're saying about like thinking about stories geometrically and shifting away from. It's weird because it's like, it's kind of the same thing, but I don't really want to think about it as the same thing because I want to do something different.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, I'm sure, really good coders are writers in the sense that there's an elegance, there's a simplicity to their code. It does what it needs to do, but it's a language. Coding is a language. It wasn't a language that I enjoyed, but I think for
Yeah.
those for those who do, it does seem like an art form in a way, a very like functional art form, but an art form.
So what's next for you? I know that's a terrible question for a debut novelist,
Yeah.
but
Mm-hmm.
how does your brain work and your writing process work? Is this consuming the energy that you would normally be using to write, or are you just still churning stuff out?
Is what consuming, like the
debut novel, the
Right.
idea of the story getting out there, the having to do like doing shows like this.
Yeah.
How's your energy with writing when something like this is happening in your life?
I'm excited. You know, I wrote
Yeah.
this book, Oh God, the Sun Goes, without knowing if it would get published, without knowing if what its life would be. And I think that is like a much harder state to be in than kind of feeling like, okay, I'm kind of doing it. And it still isn't real to me that anyone will read this book. Like, it's so cool talking to you who's like read my book, like someone I don't know who's like read it like clearly very well and very deeply. Like, that's blowing my mind. So I don't, it hasn't sunk in that anyone will really read my book yet. Like, it all doesn't feel real. So in a way, I'm just continuing to write the way I always have. And I think it just like helps that I have a sense that, you know, a book can exist ultimately in the world. Just knowing that, I think has put some, you know, like energy into my process. I'm writing another novel, finishing up a short story. Yeah, I'm just it's fun. I just like to write, so it doesn't, you know, it's sort of the same thing, but a bit easier.
Do you ever feel tortured by writing? Or no?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
well, I was just curious hearing you say like, I want to run away from Python as much as possible. And then there was a part of me that was like, shit, he might never feel bad when he's writing. And that's not my experience. So I was just so curious if you ever feel that way.
No, writing is utter hell. It's like, it's so much frustration. It's so much frustration. It's so much failure. It can be quite isolating. It can get me very internal. I can kind of get into this internal zone, and then I'll go hang out with a friend and they'll be like, is everything okay? Like, what's going on with you kind of vibe. But right now it's feeling good. The writing, I think, like the sort of fresh energy of new projects. There was something about the singularity of this book, of knowing that I like needed to finish a book to put in the world, was motivating, but also contributed to how frustrating writing can be. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how to make writing more fun, because, you know, if I'm going to do this with my life, I want to live a good life. But it's hell. It's so hard. Yeah, I wonder. It's hell for you too.
It is, yeah. It goes up and down. You know, I have those days that it doesn't feel that way. I've talked to writers who are just like, no, why would I do it if I didn't like it? I love it. And I'm just like, hats off. I'm happy for you. Because that, yeah, I mean, there are days where it's probably the worst thing that I do to myself that day is sit down to write. But it's the other side of that is that I could stop, and I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I am actively trying to figure out how to make writing feel more joyous and lighter. I think it actually helps the writing when I can do that. At the end of the day, I think it's kind of psychological. It's not even about writing. It's just like, am I like avoiding my life? Or, you know, it's more just about how I'm showing up in the world.
Yeah.
So I think it's more, I think if I think of it in those terms and I go for a walk, it becomes lighter and more joyous. And I am feeling that way these days, that it is lighter and more joyous.
A walk can seriously solve so many problems.
Yeah.
That's a big part of my process. I love going on walks, and legitimately, it has helped me so many times, not even just to figure out or like solve a writing problem, but probably to unlock that part of me that is too precious or is fighting with myself, to just be like, nah, man, just go for a walk. You're going to feel good. Just go do it.
That's it. I mean, I think that's it. It's really, I can be one of those writers who will just kind of just try to write, even though I really shouldn't be writing. Like, even, it's like, I desperately want to feel, like I've accomplished something or I've written enough sentences. And it's really sometimes best to just take a walk and kind of almost absolve myself of that like productivity need.
Yep.
I do think the writing only really happens for me when it flows and when it's effortless. And obviously there's effort that goes into creating situations that are effortless. But I think the only writing I ever do that's any good comes from a place of expression instead of like a place of, trying to achieve something that day.
I think that probably holds true for me too. And that's the other weird thing. It's different for everyone. I've seen authors talk about how they can't tell the difference between a bad day and a good day when they're rereading their writing. And sometimes that's true for me. But if it's a really bad day, then I can tell later. And, I'm not into that. But in all of that, is Oh God, the Sun Goes the longest thing you've ever finished? Or had you written any novels or anything before this?
No, I mean, I'd written I'd written only short stories. This was the first novel length thing I'd written. And so it was, I think I feel a bit more confident writing this novel that I'm writing now. Just knowing what it takes to write something of that length. But yeah, that was the first novel that I'd ever written.
Well, it's out now from Melville House. Where can people find you online? What's the best place that they could go look you and your stuff up?
I'm kind of off the grid, but I made an Instagram. You can follow me on Instagram at Oh God, the Sun Goes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's where where I kind of post stuff. So check that out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Readers, make sure you check out Oh God, the Sun Goes by David Connor, out from Melville House. Thanks, David.
Yeah, thanks so much, Austin. This is cool.
Oh God, the Sun Goes is out right now. It came out the day that this episode went live, August 1st, 2023, out from Melville House. Thank you very much to David for stopping by and chatting. It was super interesting. And hey, let me know what you guys think about the metafiction. If you read the book, let me know what you think. Is it metafictional? Also, let me know what you think about the psychedelic stuff. Give me your opinion on that. Go to austinrwilson.com. I've got a contact form there. You can find free stories, links to some of my work that's been published online, and all kinds of fun stuff. So swing by there and then rate and review the show on any podcast platform that you can find it on. Tell people that you think would like the show. It would mean a lot to me. And then stop by bookshop.org. I'll have an affiliate link in the show notes for this episode and all other episodes. And that's a great way to support the show. Thank you again for listening. I really, really appreciate it.